Rachel Torres stood in her downtown Chicago apartment, staring at the magnificent bouquet of white roses that had arrived an hour earlier. The card, written in Ethan Blake's distinctive handwriting, read, "Congratulations, VP Torres. This is just the beginning. Ethan." VP Torres. The title still sent a thrill through her chest every time she heard it. At 29, she was the youngest vice president in the history of Castellano Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms. The promotion she'd worked toward for 5 grueling years had finally come through, along with the corner office, the substantial salary increase, and, most importantly, the recognition that her ideas in leadership had value. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her wore a tailored black dress that complemented her olive complexion, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. She looked professional, confident, successful. But beneath that polished exterior, her stomach churned with familiar nervousness. Tonight was the family dinner at Alma de Cuba, the little restaurant in Pilsen where the Torres family gathered for every major celebration. Her mother had insisted on making reservations the moment Rachel called with her news 3 days ago. "Mija, this is huge! We have to celebrate properly," Marisol had gushed over the phone. "Your father will be so proud." Will he? Rachel wondered, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her dress. She'd been practicing the announcement in her mind for days. "Dad, I got promoted to vice president." Simple, direct, confident. But every time she imagined saying the words, she pictured Carlos Torres sitting across from her with that skeptical expression he wore whenever she talked about her career. The same look he gave her when she announced she was pursuing an MBA, when she landed her first job at the consulting firm, when she bought this apartment in River North that he still called too fancy for your own good. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Girl, stop overthinking this. You earned this. Dad's gonna have to admit his baby girl is a badass. See you at dinner." She smiled, despite her nerves. At 26, Sophia was the free spirit of the family, a freelance graphic designer who'd moved to Wicker Park and painted murals for local businesses. She was also the only family member who truly understood Rachel's drive, having faced their father's disapproval for choosing art over stability. Another text appeared, this one from Daniel. "Congrats again, sis. Don't let it go to your head, though. See you tonight." Rachel's smile faded slightly. Daniel meant well, she knew that. As the eldest Torres child at 31, he'd always been the golden boy, married to his college sweetheart, father of 2 adorable kids, steady job as a district manager for a grocery chain. He was everything their parents had hoped their children would become: practical, stable, traditional. His jokes about Rachel's ambition had always carried an edge she tried to ignore. She grabbed her purse and keys, taking one last look around her apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the Chicago River, and the modern furniture reflected her success. Everything here was proof of how far she'd come from the cramped 2-bedroom house in Little Village, where she'd grown up sharing a room with Sophia. But as she locked her door and headed for the elevator, Rachel realized that none of the tangible markers of her success mattered if her father couldn't see them. After all these years, after all her achievements, she still craved Carlos Torres' approval like she was 12 years old again, desperately trying to show him her perfect report card. "This time will be different," she told herself as she stepped into the cool October evening. "This time, he'll have to acknowledge what I've accomplished." The 20-minute drive to Pilsen gave her just enough time to work herself into a state of nervous energy that bordered on panic. By the time she pulled up to the restaurant, she'd run through the announcement 17 different ways, each one sounding more forced than the last. At Alma de Cuba buzzed with the warm energy of families gathered around tables laden with ropa vieja, maduros, and fresh bread. The smell of garlic and sofrito filled the air, instantly transporting Rachel back to Sunday dinners at her childhood home. She spotted her family's usual table in the back corner, the same booth they'd occupied for birthday celebrations, graduations, and holidays for as long as she could remember. Carlos Torres sat from the back to the wall, a habit left over from his army days. At 58, he still carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent 40 years supervising a factory floor. His gray hair was neatly combed, his flannel shirt pressed, and his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of café cubano. He looked up as Rachel approached, his dark eyes, so similar to her own, taking in her appearance with that familiar mixture of pride and bewilderment that always crossed his face when he saw her dressed for her corporate world. There she is. Marisol Torres rose from her seat to embrace her daughter, her face glowing with excitement. Mija, you look gorgeous. Doesn't she look gorgeous, Carlos? She looks fine, Carlos grumbled, though Rachel caught the slight softening in his expression. Too fancy for dinner, but fine. Sophia bounced up next, wrapping Rachel in a hug that smelled of vanilla perfume and paint thinner. She wore ripped jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, her curly hair wild and free, silver hoops catching the light. Everything about Sophia was a rebellion against their parents' expectations, and Rachel both envied and admired her sister's fearlessness. Not CEO yet, Rachel laughed, settling into the booth beside her mother. Just VP. Just VP, Daniel leaned across the table to give her a congratulatory hug. He looked exactly like their father had 20 years ago. Same strong jaw, same skeptical smile. Listen to her, acting all modest. Mom's been talking about this promotion nonstop for 3 days. Because it's incredible, Marisol beamed, reaching over to squeeze Rachel's hand. My daughter, the vice president. I still can't believe it. Rachel felt a flutter of warmth at her mother's genuine pride. Marisol had always been her biggest champion, even when she didn't fully understand Rachel's career. She'd attended Rachel's business school graduation, had helped her move into every apartment, and had never once questioned Rachel's decision to prioritize work over marriage and children, the way Daniel had. So what does this mean exactly? Carlos asked, his tone carefully neutral. More money? Dad, Sophia rolled her eyes. Way to cut to the chase. It's a fair question, Rachel said, grateful for the opening. This was her moment. The promotion comes with a significant salary increase, yes, but more importantly, I'll be leading the firm's expansion into sustainable business practices. I'll have my own team, my own clients, and I'll be helping shape the company's direction for the next decade. She'd practiced that explanation, knowing her father would need concrete details to understand the significance. But Carlos just nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That sounds amazing, Mija, Marisol said, her eyes shining. You've worked so hard for this. The youngest VP in company history, Rachel added, unable to keep the pride from her voice. My boss Ethan said I'm exactly the kind of leader they need for the future. Daniel whistled low. Look at you, breaking glass ceilings and stuff. Mom, you raised a real go-getter here. There was something in his tone, admiration mixed with what sounded almost like resentment, that made Rachel glance at him sharply. But he was smiling, raising his beer bottle in a mock toast. To my little sister, who apparently has better luck than the rest of us. Luck. The word hit Rachel like a small slap. It wasn't luck, Danny. I've been working toward this for years. The Mitchell account alone brought in $2 million in revenue last quarter, and that was my strategy, my team leadership. Easy there, Tiger, Daniel laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I'm just saying you caught a break, that's all. Right place, right time. These corporate types, they probably needed to promote a woman anyway, for appearances. It's not about appearances. They promoted me because I earned it. Of course you did, sweetheart, Marisol said quickly, shooting a warning look at Daniel. Your brother didn't mean anything by it. But the damage was done. The joy Rachel had felt moments earlier began to curdle in her stomach. She looked across the table at her father, waiting for him to speak, to defend her, to acknowledge her achievement. Carlos Torres might not understand the corporate world, but he'd always valued hard work. Surely he would see that his daughter had earned this success. Carlos took a long sip of coffee, set the cup down deliberately, and looked directly at Rachel. When he finally spoke, his words would shatter her carefully constructed hope. One promotion doesn't mean you've made it, Mija. Carlos's voice was matter-of-fact, almost gentle, which somehow made his words cut deeper than if he'd been angry. He leaned back in the booth, his calloused fingers drumming once against the table. I'm just being realistic, he shrugged, his expression unchanged. In my day, you worked at a place for 10, 20 years before they even considered promoting you. You put in your time, proved your loyalty. These corporate jobs today, they'll promote anyone to make themselves look good. Doesn't mean it's earned. I felt like I'd been punched. Every word was calculated to minimize my achievement.
to reduce 5 years of 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, and sacrificed relationships to mere chance. Dad, he's right, Daniel interjected, and Rachel turned to stare at her brother in disbelief. I mean, it's great and all rage, but it's still early days. You've got to prove you can handle the responsibility now. That's when the real work starts.
But Daniel continued, seemingly oblivious to the pain spreading across Rachel's face. I'm just saying, don't count your chickens before they hatch. You know how these things go. Up one day, out the next. Remember what happened to Cousin Miguel when that construction company promoted him too fast? 6 months later, they let him go. That's completely different, Rachel managed, her voice smaller than she intended. Miguel didn't have the experience or qualifications. Neither do you, apparently, Carlos said quietly. 5 years? That's nothing. I worked the same job for 40 years, Rachel. 40 years. I earned every promotion, every raise, every bit of respect I got through consistency and dedication. You young people, you think you can skip all that, jump straight to the top because you have some fancy degree. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Rachel felt her carefully constructed confidence crumbling, revealing the insecure little girl underneath who'd spent her entire childhood trying to prove she was worthy of her father's attention. She remembered being 10 years old, bringing home a certificate for perfect attendance, only for him to grunt and ask why Daniel's teacher called him a natural leader, while Rachel's just said she followed directions well. Carlos, that's enough, Marisol said, her voice firmer now, but it was too little, too late, and they all knew it. I'm not trying to hurt her feelings, Carlos continued, his tone still maddeningly reasonable. I'm trying to prepare her for reality. The corporate world is ruthless. They build you up just to tear you down. Better she knows now that this promotion is just the beginning, not the end. It's not just the beginning, Rachel said, her voice cracking slightly. It's recognition for work I've already done, projects I've led, strategies I've developed, clients I've brought in. Sure, Carlos waved a hand dismissively, but let's see what happens when the pressure really kicks in, when they expect results. Anyone can shine for a few months, but can you sustain it? Can you handle it when things get tough and they're looking for someone to blame? Rachel stared at her father, searching his weathered face for any sign of pride, any hint of acknowledgement for what she'd accomplished, but all she saw was the same skeptical doubt he'd shown every time she'd reached for something beyond his understanding. When she'd gotten into business school on a partial scholarship, he'd warned her about getting in over her head. When she'd bought her apartment, he'd predicted she'd lose it in a market crash. When she started dating her last boyfriend, a fellow consultant, Carlos said it would never last because career women can't hold on to a man. Every prediction had been wrong, but that never seemed to matter. Carlos Torres had a gift for finding the cloud in every silver lining, the potential failure in every success. Rachel had always told herself it was his way of protecting her, of preparing her for disappointment. But sitting here now, watching him systematically dismantle the biggest achievement of her life, she realized the truth was much simpler and more painful. He simply didn't believe in her. You know what, Dad? Sophia's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Rachel has accomplished more in 5 years than most people do in their entire careers. She put herself through graduate school, built a reputation in one of the most competitive industries in Chicago, and now she's been promoted to a position that comes with real responsibility and respect. Maybe instead of looking for reasons why she doesn't deserve it, you could try being proud of her. Carlos's jaw tightened. I am proud. I'm always proud of my children. But pride and realism aren't the same thing. Neither are realism and pessimism, Sophia shot back. Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes and knew she had to get out of there before she embarrassed herself further. The celebration she had imagined, the one where her father finally saw her as the accomplished woman she had become, dissolved into the familiar pattern of doubt and dismissal that had defined their relationship for years. I need some air, she mumbled, sliding out of the booth. Rachel, wait! Marisol called after her, but Rachel was already weaving between tables toward the exit, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Behind her, she could hear Sophia's voice rising in anger, Daniel mumbling something about not meaning to upset anyone, and her mother trying to smooth over the conflict as she always did. But Carlos remained silent, probably satisfied that he'd once again managed to bring his overreaching daughter
back down to earth. As Rachel pushed through the restaurant's front door into the cool October night, she realized that some things never changed. No matter how high she climbed, no matter what she achieved, she would always be that little girl desperately seeking approval from a man who seemed determined never to give it to her. The promotion party at her firm was scheduled for next week. Important colleagues would be there, along with clients and mentors who'd supported her rise. She had planned to invite her family, to show them her professional world, to let them see the respect she had earned. Now, standing alone on the sidewalk, outside a restaurant full of celebrating families, Rachel wondered if there was any point in extending that invitation at all. The October air bit at Rachel's skin as she stood on the sidewalk outside Alma de Cuba, her breath forming small clouds in the lamplight. Cars moved steadily down 18th Street,
Headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying people to their own destinations, their own celebrations, their own disappointments. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of confidence that had shattered inside the restaurant. Rachel! She turned to see Sophia pushing through the restaurant's front door, her expression fierce with protective anger. Her younger sister's curly hair caught the wind as she approached, and Rachel could see the fight still blazing in her dark eyes. "Don't let him do this to you," Sophia said without preamble, reaching out to touch Rachel's arm. "Don't let him make you feel small." Rachel let out a shaky laugh that bordered on a sob. Too late for that. She looked back toward the restaurant's warm windows, where she could see the shadow of her family still seated around their table. "I actually thought this time would be different, Soph. I thought maybe if I achieved something big enough, important enough, he'd finally see me." "He sees you," Sophia said firmly. "He just can't handle what he's looking at." They walked a few steps down the sidewalk, away from the restaurant's entrance, finding a quiet spot between two parked cars. The sounds of the city seemed muted here. Distant traffic, the occasional laugh from a passing couple, the faint music spilling from a bar down the street. "You know what the worst part is?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm 29 years old. I have my own apartment, my own career, my own life. But the second he starts talking like that, I turn into that 8-year-old kid again, the one who brought home straight A's and watched him nod once before asking Daniel about his soccer game." Sophia's jaw tightened. "I remember that. I remember all of it." Rachel closed her eyes, letting herself fall back into memories she usually tried to keep buried. "Do you remember when I won that essay contest in 6th grade? The one about Chicago history? I was so excited because the prize was $50, and back then that felt like a fortune. I ran home to tell him, and he said..." Her voice caught. "He said writers don't make money," Sophia finished quietly. "He said you should focus on practical skills." And then Daniel came home an hour later with a B- on some math test, and Dad spent 20 minutes explaining how proud he was of Danny's improvement. Rachel opened her eyes, staring up at the Chicago skyline. That's when I learned that my achievements didn't count the same way, that I had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Sophia moved closer, her shoulder bumping against Rachel's. "You know what I learned growing up in that house? That Dad's approval isn't actually the prize we thought it was. It's preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "It's conditional, it's limited, and it comes with so many strings attached that you end up trapped instead of celebrated." Rachel turned to study her sister's profile. At 26, she had found a way to live authentically that Rachel envied. She had chosen her art over her father's expectations, had moved out at 22, despite his predictions of failure, and had somehow managed to build a life that made her genuinely happy. She struggled financially sometimes, worked odd jobs between commissions, but she had never seemed to doubt that she was living the life she was meant to live. How do you do it? How do you just not care what he thinks? Sophia was quiet for a long moment. watching a couple walk by with their arms linked, laughing about something private and joyful. "I spent 3 years in therapy," she said finally. 3 years learning that his opinion of me says more about him than it does about me. Dad judges everything through the lens of his own fear. Fear of change, fear of risk, fear of anything he can't understand or control. When he looks at your success, he doesn't see achievement. He sees danger. Danger? Think about it. You represent everything he was taught not to trust. Corporate America, higher education, ambition that goes beyond stability. In his world, people like you are the ones who make decisions that affect people like him. You're not your little girl anymore, Rachel. You're one of them. And he doesn't know how to process that. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, like a knot loosening after being pulled tight. So it really isn't about me. It's never been about you. Sophia's voice was gentle but certain. It's about his limitations, not yours. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the life of the neighborhood flow around them. A group of teenagers passed by, speaking rapid Spanish and laughing at some shared joke. An elderly couple walked slowly past, the man's arm protectively around the woman's waist. Normal people living normal lives, probably not worried about whether their fathers approved of their career choices. "You know what you need to do? Therapy?" Rachel managed a weak smile.
Well, that too. But first, you need to go to your promotion party next week and let the people who actually understand your worth celebrate you properly. Show them. Show yourself what you've accomplished. Rachel had almost forgotten about the party. Ethan had reserved a private room at the Signature Room on the 95th floor of the John Hancock Building, with views of the entire city and Lake Michigan beyond. It was exactly the kind of elegant, sophisticated celebration that matched the significance of her promotion. The guest list included the firm's partners, key clients, and several mentors who'd supported her rise through the company. "I don't know if I can face it right now," Rachel admitted. "What if Dad's voice is right? What if this really was just luck, and everyone figures that out?" "Listen to me." Sophia turned to face her fully, gripping both of Rachel's arms. "I have watched you work your ass off for years. I've seen you take calls at 11 o'clock at night, skip family functions to meet deadlines, and sacrifice weekend after weekend to build something meaningful. I've watched you navigate office politics with grace, mentor younger employees, and bring in clients who specifically requested you because of your reputation. That's not luck, Rachel. That's excellence." Rachel felt tears threaten again, but this time they came from gratitude rather than hurt. When did my little sister get so wise? Probably around the time I realized that seeking Dad's approval was like trying to water a plastic plant. You can pour everything you have into it, but it's never going to grow into what you need it to be. They both laughed at that, the sound carrying some of the evening's tension away with it. Rachel pulled her sister into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with paint and possibility. "Come on," Sophia said as they separated. "Let's go back in there. I want to see Mom, and I'm pretty sure I left Danny speechless for the first time in his life." "What did you say to him?" Sophia's grin was wicked. "I asked him when he was going to stop being threatened by his little sister's success and start being proud of it instead. He turned an interesting shade of red." Rachel's apartment felt different when she returned home that night. The flowers from Ethan still sat on her kitchen counter, but they seemed to mock her now, rather than celebrate her. The city lights twinkled beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows, but instead of feeling like she was part of something magnificent, she felt isolated and small. She kicked off her heels and padded to the bathroom where she stared at her reflection while removing her makeup. The woman in the mirror looked tired, older than her 29 years. The careful composure she'd constructed for the dinner had cracked, revealing the vulnerable girl underneath who still craved her father's approval despite all logic and self-respect. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Hope the family dinner went well. Don't forget the promotion party planning meeting tomorrow at 2. So excited to celebrate you properly." Rachel stared at the message, feeling the gulf between her professional and personal worlds more acutely than ever. At work, she was respected, valued, seen as a leader and innovator. At home, she was still the overachiever trying too hard to prove herself worthy of love. She changed into soft pajamas and poured herself a glass of wine, settling onto her couch with the intention of watching something mindless on Netflix. But before she could reach for the remote, her phone rang. The display showed a number she didn't recognize, so she let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification chimed. Something made her check it immediately instead of waiting until morning. The voice that filled her living room was soft, hesitant, and achingly familiar. "Mija, it's Mom. I'm calling from Mrs. Herrera's phone because I didn't want your father to hear." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of Marisol's careful breathing. "I need you to know that what happened tonight, that wasn't okay. Your father, he doesn't mean to hurt you, but he does it anyway. And I'm tired of making excuses for him." Rachel set down her wine glass, her full attention focused on her mother's voice. "You know, when I was your age, women like me didn't have choices like you do. I got married at 20, had Daniel at 21, and spent the next 30 years making sure everyone else's needs came first. I don't regret my life, Mija. I love being your mother. I love our family. But sometimes I look at you and I see all the possibilities I never had. And instead of feeling sad for myself, I feel proud. So proud I could burst." Marisol's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Your father comes from a different time, a different world. In his mind, work is something you endure to put food on the table, not something that brings joy or fulfillment. He worked that factory job for 40 years because he had to, not because he wanted to. When he looks at your ambition, your success, part of him can't understand why you'd choose to work so hard when you could just find a nice man to take care of you." Rachel closed her eyes, seeing her mother clearly in her mind. Probably sitting in her neighbor's kitchen, speaking in whispers, her graying hair pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn for as long as Rachel can remember. "But I understand," Marisol continued. "I see what you've built, and it's beautiful. You're not just successful, Mija. You're happy. You wake up every day excited about your work, proud of—"
You do. That's something your father never had. And instead of being happy that you found it, he's scared of it. There was another pause, longer this time, and Rachel could hear voices in the background, probably the family evening news routine that never varied. "I should have said something tonight. I should have stood up for you the way Sophia did. But I've spent so many years trying to keep peace in this family that I forgot sometimes peace isn't worth the price we pay for it." Marisol's voice grew thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm sorry your father can't see what a remarkable woman you've become, and I'm sorry I didn't defend you the way you deserved. But I need you to know, I see you. I'm proud of you, and you don't need anyone's permission to be proud of yourself." The message ended with a soft click, leaving Rachel alone in her apartment with tears streaming down her cheeks. But these weren't the bitter tears of disappointment she'd shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of love, of a connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She saved the message, then played it again, letting her mother's words wash over her like a benediction. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, Rachel felt something other than hurt and anger. She felt seen, understood, validated by the person whose opinion had always mattered most, even more than her father's, though she'd never admitted that to herself before. Marisol Torres had spent 30 years sublimating her own dreams for her family's needs. She'd been the peacemaker, the nurturer, the one who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged everyone to just get along. But tonight, she'd chosen her daughter over family harmony, and that choice meant everything. Rachel curled up on her couch, her phone clutched in her hands, and thought about the promotion party. Maybe Sophia was right. Maybe it was time to let the people who truly understood her worth celebrate her properly.
Maybe it was time to stop seeking validation from someone who would never be able to give it and start accepting it from those who offered it freely. Her reflection in the dark windows looked different now. Not smaller, but clearer. She was Rachel Torres, the youngest VP in her firm's history. She was a woman who'd worked her way up through talent and determination. She was someone whose mother was proud of her, whose sister believed in her, whose colleagues respected her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The signature room's private dining area hummed with sophisticated conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Chicago at twilight, the city spread out below like a glittering jewel box. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly to the east, its dark waters reflecting the last traces of sunset. Rachel stood near the windows, champagne flute in hand, accepting congratulations from colleagues who genuinely seemed thrilled by her promotion. The contrast to the previous week's family dinner couldn't have been more stark. Here, no one questioned whether she deserved her success or suggested it was merely luck. Here, people spoke about her strategic mind, her leadership skills, her innovative approaches to client challenges. "Rachel, you absolutely have to meet Marcus Chen," said Jennifer Walsh, one of the firm's senior partners. She guided Rachel toward a distinguished-looking man in his 50s. "Marcus, this is our newest VP, Rachel Torres. She's the one behind the sustainable business initiative that's been getting so much attention." Marcus Chen extended his hand with a warm smile. "Miss Torres, I've been following your work with great interest. My company is looking to overhaul our environmental impact strategy, and from what I've heard, you're exactly the kind of forward-thinking leader we need." As Rachel discussed potential collaboration with a client who clearly respected her expertise, she felt the last remnants of her father's words beginning to fade. This was her world, her arena, the place where her mind and abilities were not just recognized, but celebrated. "There's our star." Rachel turned to see Ethan Blake approaching, his face lit up with genuine pride. At 45, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd built something meaningful and knew it. He'd founded Castellano Associates 12 years ago with a vision of creating a consulting firm that prioritized both profit and purpose. Under his leadership, the company had become known for taking on challenging projects that other firms avoided and for developing innovative solutions that often became industry standards. "Ethan, thank you for arranging all this," Rachel gestured around the elegant room. "It's perfect." "You deserve perfect. Actually, you deserve better than perfect, but this was the best I could do on short notice." His expression grew more serious. "I hope you know how much this promotion means, not just to you, but to the entire firm. You're not just our youngest VP, Rachel, you're our brightest." Before Rachel could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. The maitre d' was speaking in hushed tones with someone just out of view, and she could hear a familiar voice growing louder with frustration. "We're family. She's our daughter. Why wouldn't we be on some list?" Rachel's stomach dropped as she recognized Carlos Torres' distinctive baritone, tinged with the irritation he always displayed when confronted with what he considered unnecessary bureaucracy. She watched in growing mortification as her entire family came into view, her father in his best khakis and button-down shirt, looking uncomfortable and out of place, her mother wearing the navy dress she reserved for special occasions, her face anxious, Daniel in a
suit that was slightly too tight, checking his phone, and Sophia, who'd clearly made an effort to look professional in black slacks and a blazer, but whose artistic sensibility still showed in her silver jewelry and bold red lipstick. "Oh my God," Rachel breathed, setting down her champagne glass with hands that had begun to tremble. Ethan followed her gaze and immediately understood the situation. "Family?" he asked gently. "I didn't invite them," Rachel said quickly. "I mean, I thought about it, but after last week?" She trailed off, watching her mother spot her across the room and wave enthusiastically. "Rachel, there you are!" Marisol called out, her voice carrying across the sophisticated murmur of corporate conversation. Every head in the room turned to look, and Rachel felt heat flood her cheeks. Carlos surveyed the room with the same skeptical expression he'd worn at the restaurant, taking in the elegant decor, the stunning views, the well-dressed professionals with their champagne and canapes. His weathered face showed exactly what he thought of such extravagance. "Fancy," Daniel muttered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Must have cost a fortune." "Danny, hush," Sophia whispered.
but her eyes found Rachel's across the room with an apologetic expression that clearly said, "I tried to stop them." Rachel felt suspended between two worlds that had no business intersecting. Her colleagues continued their conversations, but she could sense their curiosity about the family that had appeared uninvited at her celebration. These were people who knew her as polished, professional, always in control. They'd never seen her as the daughter who still craved approval from a man who seemed incapable of giving it. "Should I handle this?" Ethan asked quietly. "No, it's fine," Rachel lied, straightening her shoulders and walking toward her family with what she hoped looked like confidence. "Mom, Dad, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming." "We wanted to see where you work," Marisol said, her eyes bright with genuine wonder as she took in the opulent surroundings. "Mija, this is incredible. You can see the whole city." Carlos remained silent, his arms crossed, as he surveyed the room like a general assessing enemy territory. Rachel could practically see the calculations running through his mind. How much the venue cost, how much the catering cost, whether such expense was justified for just a promotion. "Fancy," Daniel muttered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Must have cost a fortune." "Danny, hush," Sophia whispered, but her eyes found Rachel's across the room with an apologetic expression that clearly said, "I tried to stop them." Rachel felt suspended between two worlds that had no business intersecting. Her colleagues continued their conversations, but she could sense their curiosity about the family that had appeared uninvited at her celebration. These were people who knew her as polished, professional, always in control. They'd never seen her as the daughter who still craved approval from a man who seemed incapable of giving it. "Should I handle this?" Ethan asked quietly. "No, it's fine," Rachel lied, straightening her shoulders and walking toward her family with what she hoped looked like confidence. "Mom, Dad, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming." "We wanted to see where you work," Marisol said, her eyes bright with genuine wonder as she took in the opulent surroundings. "Mija, this is incredible. You can see the whole city." Carlos remained silent, his arms crossed as he surveyed the room like a general assessing enemy territory. Rachel could practically see the calculations running through his mind. How much the venue cost, how much the catering cost, whether such expense was justified for just a promotion. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice tight with embarrassment. "What? I'm just making an observation." Carlos looked around the room again, his gaze settling on the elaborate buffet, the open bar, the string quartet playing softly in the corner. "In my day, you got promoted, you maybe got a handshake and a small raise. All this," he jested vaguely at the elegance surrounding them, "seems like a lot of fuss for one person." Rachel felt the familiar shame wash over her, the sense that her achievements were somehow excessive, inappropriate, unearned. But before she could respond, she caught Sophia's eye. Her sister was watching her with an expression of fierce encouragement, silently reminding her of their conversation on the sidewalk outside Alma de Cuba. "His limitations, not yours," Rachel reminded herself, but knowing that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two very different things. Especially here, in front of colleagues who respected her, watching her father systematically diminish the significance of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. The evening was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, it was becoming another painful reminder that some distances could never be bridged, no matter how high she climbed or how much she accomplished.
The tension at Rachel's promotion party thickened like humidity before a storm. Carlos Torres stood with his arms crossed in the center of the elegant room, his skeptical gaze taking in every detail with the precision of a building inspector looking for code violations. The string quartet continued their soft rendition of classical pieces, but Rachel could swear the music had grown more subdued, as if even the musicians sensed the awkwardness radiating from her family's corner. "Would you like something to drink?" Ethan asked, his professional composure intact, despite Carlos's obvious hostility.
The bar has an excellent selection, or their champagne. I don't drink, Carlos interrupted curtly, especially not on a weeknight. Some of us have real jobs to get to tomorrow. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Around them, Rachel's colleagues exchanged glances that ranged from uncomfortable to openly shocked. These were people accustomed to corporate diplomacy, to subtle negotiations and carefully phrased criticisms. Carlos's blunt dismissal of their celebration, and by extension, their industry, was like a slap delivered at a garden party. "Carlos," Marisol whispered urgently, her face flushed with embarrassment. "What? I'm just being honest." He shrugged, seemingly oblivious to the mortification spreading across his daughter's face. "Look around, Marisol. Look at all this waste. The flowers, the fancy food, the musicians. You know what this party probably cost? More than most families make in a month." Jennifer Walsh, the senior partner who'd introduced Rachel to Marcus Chen, approached their group with the careful smile of someone attempting diplomatic intervention. "Mr. Torres, I hope you're enjoying the evening. We're all so excited to celebrate Rachel's achievements." Carlos turned his attention to Jennifer, his weathered face showing exactly what he thought of her designer dress and perfectly styled hair. "Achievements," he repeated, the words somehow sounding like an accusation. "Tell me something, Miss Walsh. Jennifer Walsh. Miss Walsh, how long has my daughter actually worked for your company?" Rachel felt her blood turn to ice water. "Dad, please." "5 years," Jennifer replied, her professional composure beginning to show strain. "And in that time, she's been consistently one of our top performers." 5 years, Carlos nodded slowly, as if this confirmed his worst suspicions. "And now she's a vice president. Doesn't that seem fast to you? In my world, people work 20, 30 years before they get that kind of responsibility." The conversations around them had begun to quiet, with more and more people turning to listen to the exchange that was rapidly spiraling beyond social acceptability. Rachel could see Daniel watching with what looked like fascination, as if he was enjoying the spectacle. Sophia's face, by contrast, was pale with fury. "Different industries operate on different timelines," Jennifer said diplomatically. "In consulting, we promote based on performance and potential rather than seniority alone." "Potential," Carlos repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "That's a nice way of saying unproven, isn't it?" Rachel felt something shatter inside her chest. The professional identity she'd worked so hard to build, the respect she'd earned from colleagues and clients, was being systematically demolished by a man who couldn't understand that the corporate world operated by different rules than a factory floor. "Sir," Marcus Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his judgment questioned. "I've been in business for 30 years, and I can tell you that talent like your daughter's is rare, at any age. The strategies she's developed have revolutionized how companies approach sustainability. She's not just impressive for someone her age, she's impressive, period." Carlos turned his skeptical gaze on Marcus. "And you are?" "Marcus Chen, CEO of Chen Industries. We're hoping to work with Rachel on a major project because of her reputation in the field." "Reputation?" Carlos said, as if the word tasted bitter. "Built on what, exactly? 5 years of experience?" He looked directly at Rachel, his eyes holding that familiar mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "You see, this is what I'm talking about, mija. Everyone's so impressed by the fancy title and the big party, but what happens when they expect you to actually deliver? What happens when the real pressure starts?" The room had gone almost silent now, with only the string quartet's music providing a soundtrack to Rachel's public humiliation. She could feel the eyes of every colleague, every client, every professional contact she'd cultivated over 5 years of careful relationship building. These were people who'd seen her lead teams through complex projects, who'd watched her navigate difficult negotiations, who'd benefited from her strategic insights. But now they were witnessing her father reduce all of that to luck, and inexperience. "Sir?" Marcus Chen stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, and Rachel looked up to see her CEO's face had hardened into an expression she'd only seen him wear during the most challenging business negotiations. "I think, perhaps, you don't fully understand what your daughter has accomplished."
Oh, I understand perfectly, Carlos shot back, his own voice rising. I understand that corporations love to promote young people they can control, people who don't know enough to question their methods. I understand that my daughter is being set up to take the fall when something goes wrong, because that's how these places work. Daniel, who'd been unusually quiet, chose that moment to add his voice to the conversation. Dad's got a point, he said with a casual shrug that made Rachel want to disappear into the floor. I mean, no offense, Rachel, but this does seem pretty fast. Are you sure you're ready for this level of responsibility? The betrayal in that question cut deeper than anything Carlos had said. Daniel knew her, had watched her work through college and graduate school, had seen her dedication and drive firsthand. Yet here he was, publicly undermining her in front of the people whose respect she'd spent years earning. "Danny!" Sophia hissed, her voice barely controlled. "What? I'm just asking. It's a legitimate question." Daniel looked around the room with an expression that suggested he was the only one brave enough to voice what everyone was thinking. Sometimes when things move this fast, there's more to the story than what meets the eye. Rachel felt the walls of the elegant room closing in around her. The city lights beyond the windows, which had seemed so beautiful an hour ago, now felt cold and distant. The celebration that was supposed to mark her triumph had become a public dissection of her worthiness, conducted by the two men whose respect she'd spent years earning. "That's enough," Sophia said, her voice cutting across the room with surprising force. "Both of you, that's enough." But the damage was done. Rachel could see it in the faces around her. The confusion, the discomfort, the professional distance that was already beginning to form as her colleagues reassessed what they'd witnessed. In 5 minutes, her father and brother had managed to undermine 5 years of carefully built credibility. "I need some air," Rachel whispered, but before she could move toward the exit, Ethan stepped forward. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention, "I think now would be a perfect time for the formal toast I had planned." He signaled to one of the servers, who quickly handed him a microphone. "If everyone could gather around, I'd like to say a few words about why we're really here tonight." Rachel felt a flutter of panic. The last thing she wanted was more attention, more spotlight on the humiliation her family had just delivered. But Ethan's expression was determined, and she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression he wore when he was about to close a deal that everyone thought was impossible. Ethan Blake stood at the center of the room, microphone in hand, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the elegantly appointed space. The string quartet had paused their performance, and the gentle murmur of conversation died away as colleagues, clients, and the Torres family turned to face him. The city lights of Chicago glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, creating a backdrop that seemed almost theatrical in its grandeur. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd built an empire through vision and determination. "We're gathered here tonight to celebrate something truly remarkable. Not just a promotion, though that's certainly worth celebrating. We're here to recognize a leader whose innovative thinking has fundamentally changed how our industry approaches some of its greatest challenges." Rachel stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel her father's skeptical gaze boring into her from across the room, could sense Daniel's smirking disbelief, could practically hear the mental calculations Carlos was making about corporate manipulation and false praise. 3 years ago, Ethan continued, his eyes finding Rachel across the room, our firm was asked to consult on what seemed like an impossible project. Meridian Manufacturing wanted to completely overhaul their operations to become carbon neutral within 18 months without compromising their profit margins or laying off a single employee. Every other consulting firm in Chicago told them it couldn't be done. The room was completely silent now, professional attention focused entirely on Ethan's words.
Rachel remembered that project vividly. The months of research, the countless meetings with engineers and environmental scientists, the late nights developing strategies that balanced fiscal responsibility with environmental stewardship. Rachel Torres took one look at that challenge and saw possibility where everyone else saw impossibility. She didn't just develop a plan, she created a revolutionary framework that has since been adopted by 6 other major manufacturers in the Midwest. Ethan's voice grew stronger, more passionate. The Meridian Project alone has eliminated over 200,000 tons of carbon emissions annually, while actually increasing the company's profitability by 12%. Rachel caught Marcus Chen nodding approvingly, his expression one of growing respect. Other colleagues were smiling, remembering their own experiences working with her, their own witness to her capabilities. But that's just one example. Ethan continued. Over the past 5 years, Rachel has led 43 major projects. Not participated in, led. Projects with the combined value of over $50 million. Her client retention rate is 96%, the highest in our firm's history.
Companies don't just request her services once. They come back again and again because they know she delivers results that exceed expectations. Carlos's expression had begun to change, the skeptical certainty wavering as concrete numbers and specific achievements replaced the vague corporate speak he'd expected. Beside him, Marisol was beaming with undisguised pride, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Last year, when Thomson Industries was facing potential bankruptcy, their board of directors specifically requested Rachel to lead their restructuring effort. Not the firm, Rachel, personally. They'd heard about her work with distressed companies, about her ability to find solutions that others miss. Ethan paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room. She saved 1,400 jobs and turned a failing company into one of the most profitable mid-sized manufacturers in Illinois. Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were different from the tears of humiliation she'd been fighting all evening. These came from recognition, from having her work, her real work, the projects that had consumed her days and nights, acknowledged by someone who truly understood their significance. What makes Rachel exceptional isn't just her analytical skills, though they're formidable. It's her ability to see beyond the obvious solutions, to understand that sustainable business practices aren't just good for the environment, they're good for the bottom line. She's pioneered approaches that other consultants are now scrambling to replicate. Daniel's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression Rachel had never seen on her brother's face before. Something that looked almost like awe. Sophia was grinning broadly, her earlier anger transformed into vindication. 6 months ago, Harvard Business School asked Rachel to guest lecture on sustainable manufacturing practices. MIT invited her to join their advisory board on corporate environmental responsibility. These aren't honors given to people who got lucky, are people who were promoted too quickly. These are recognitions given to genuine experts, to thought leaders who are shaping the future of their field. Ethan's eyes found Carlos across the room, and his tone became more direct, more personal. When I decided to promote Rachel to vice president, it wasn't because she'd been here for a certain number of years. It wasn't because we needed to fill a quota or make ourselves look good. It was because she had already been operating at the executive level for the past 2 years, taking on responsibilities and delivering results that surpassed what we typically expect from partners, let alone associates. The CEO's voice grew warmer, more intimate as he looked directly at Rachel. In 12 years of running this company, I have never encountered anyone with Rachel's combination of intellectual rigor, creative problem-solving, and genuine care for the impact of her work. She doesn't just complete projects, she transforms them. She doesn't just satisfy clients, she exceeds their wildest expectations. Rachel wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts at composure.
Around the room, colleagues were nodding, clients were smiling, and she could feel the professional respect that her father's words had threatened to undermine flowing back like a tide. The promotion we're celebrating tonight isn't the beginning of Rachel's leadership. It's the formal recognition of leadership she has already been demonstrating for years. And frankly, we're the lucky ones. We're lucky to have her, lucky to learn from her, lucky to be associated with the innovations she continues to develop. Ethan raised his champagne glass, and the rest of the room followed suit. To Rachel Torres, whose vision, dedication, and brilliance have earned her a place among the finest business minds of her generation. The future of consulting isn't just bright because of leaders like Rachel. The future will be shaped by leaders like Rachel. The room erupted in applause, genuine and enthusiastic, led by colleagues who'd worked with her, clients who'd benefited from her strategies, and mentors who'd watched her rise through a combination of talent and relentless hard work. The sound washed over Rachel like a benediction, drowning out years of self-doubt and paternal skepticism. But as the applause died down and conversations resumed, Rachel's eyes found her father across the room. Carlos Torres stood motionless, his weathered face a study of conflicting emotions. For the first time in her memory, he looked uncertain, as if the foundation of his understanding had shifted beneath his feet. The daughter he dismissed as lucky had just been publicly praised as a visionary. The promotion he'd called premature had been revealed as overdue recognition for years of exceptional performance. The corporate world he'd distrusted had just demonstrated that it valued exactly the qualities he'd raised her to possess: hard work, integrity, and excellence. Rachel set down her champagne glass and walked across the room toward her family. It was time for the conversation she should have had years ago. Rachel found her father standing alone on the observation deck outside the Signature Room's main dining area. The October wind whipped around the 95th floor of the John Hancock building, carrying with it the crisp promise of winter and the distant sounds of the city far below. Carlos Torres stood with his hands braced against the railing, staring out at the lights of Chicago as if trying to read meaning in their patterns. "Dad?" Rachel's voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the wind and the ambient noise of the city. Carlos didn't turn around immediately. When he finally did, his weathered face showed an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of pride and regret, understanding and confusion. "That was quite a speech," he said, his voice lacking its usual certainty.
It was the truth. Rachel moved to stand beside him at the railing, the city sprawling out beneath them like a living map of possibility. Everything Ethan said in there, those weren't exaggerations or corporate flattery. Those were facts. They stood in silence for a moment, father and daughter separated by more than just the few feet between them. The wind carried the scent of lake water and distant rain, and Rachel pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "You never told me," Carlos said finally, "about Harvard, about MIT, about any of it. Would you have believed me if I had?" The question came out sharper than Rachel intended, but she didn't soften it. The time for diplomatic conversations had passed. Carlos winced slightly, the barb finding its mark. "I would have listened." "No, Dad, you wouldn't have. You would have found a way to minimize it, just like you've minimized everything else I've ever accomplished." Rachel turned to face him fully, her voice gaining strength with each word. "When I graduated summa cum laude from business school, you said education was just theory. When I bought my apartment, you said I was living beyond my means. When I got my first promotion, you said it was because I worked for a small company where advancement was easy." Carlos's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was actually listening. "For 30 years, I've been trying to earn something from you that you've never been willing to give. Your approval, your respect, your acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, your daughter had grown into someone worth being proud of." "I am proud of you," Carlos said quietly, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears.
No, Dad, you're not. You're confused by me. You're threatened by me. You're ashamed that I chose a path you don't understand instead of the safe, predictable life you mapped out for me. Rachel turned to face him fully, her voice gaining strength with each word. Do you know what the worst part is? I believed you. For all these years, despite every achievement, despite every recognition, despite every piece of evidence that I was good at what I do, I still heard your voice in my head telling me it was luck, telling me it was too much, telling me I was somehow fooling everyone, including myself. The wind gusted around them, and Carlos pulled his jacket tighter. His face showed the strain of a man grappling with truths he'd spent years avoiding. I didn't mean to, he started, then stopped. I was trying to protect you. From what? From success? From achievement? From building a life that makes me happy? Rachel shook her head. Dad, I know you worked hard your entire life. I know you made sacrifices for our family that I'll never fully understand. But your way wasn't the only way, and your definition of success isn't the only valid one. Carlos looked out over the city again, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. 40 years I worked in that plant. 40 years of the same routine, the same people, the same problems. I told myself it was worth it because it provided for my family, because it was stable, because it was honest work. He paused, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. But listening to that man talk about your work tonight, the companies you've saved, the jobs you've created, the problems you've solved, I realized something. You've accomplished more in 5 years than I did in 40. You've made a bigger impact, helped more people, changed more lives. Rachel felt her anger begin to soften, but she didn't let her guard down completely. She'd heard too many qualified apologies from her father over the years. And instead of being proud of that, Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger, I was scared. Scared that your success meant my life was somehow smaller. Scared that if I admitted how remarkable you are, it would mean I wasn't remarkable at all. The admission hung between them like a bridge Rachel wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Part of her wanted to comfort him, to assure him that his sacrifices had value, that his life had meaning. But a larger part of her was tired of managing his emotions at the expense of her own. Your life has value, Dad. The sacrifices you made, the stability you provided, the work ethic you taught us, all of that matters, but it doesn't become less valuable just because I chose a different path. And my success doesn't become less real just because it makes you uncomfortable. Carlos nodded slowly, as if each word was being carefully weighed and measured. You're right, he said, and for the first time Rachel could remember, there was no qualification following those words, no but that would undermine everything that came before. I need you to understand something, Rachel said, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. I'm not going to keep trying to earn your approval. I'm not going to keep minimizing my achievements or apologizing for my ambition. I'm good at what I do, Dad. I'm really, really good at it, and I deserve to be proud of that. She turned to leave, then paused. You raised me to work hard, to be honest, to care about doing things right. Everything I've accomplished, I accomplished using the values you taught me. The only difference is I applied them in a world you don't understand. Rachel. Carlos's voice stopped her. When she turned back, she saw something in his face she'd been waiting her entire life to see. Genuine recognition. You've done well. More than well. You've done extraordinary things.